Buenos días mi gente y bienvenido a mi canal. Hoy vamos a aprender sobre la fascinante historia y el estado actual de un idioma indígena aquí en México que se llama el Nahuatl, que es uno de los idiomas más antiguos e influyentes en el continente americano. Este idioma fue el idioma de los aztecas o los mexicas. Fue el idioma hablado en la gran ciudad de Tenochtitlán. Si tú quieres aprender sobre la historia del Nahuatl, este es el video para ti. Vámonos. So, Nahuatl is a Uto-Aztecan language that traces its history back over 1,500 years. It was spoken by various indigenous nations across Mesoamerica, meaning North and Central America, right? Specifically the Aztecs, who were the most powerful and most influential civilization in this area at the time, right? And it became a lingua franca for the towns and the peoples that they conquered, right? It originated in the center of Mexico around what is now Mexico City, and from there spread out as the Aztec Empire expanded. So as the Aztec Empire grew, the reach of Nahuatl expanded, and it wasn't just the language of the Aztec royalty, it became a lingua franca through trade, through commerce, and through travel for many groups in the region. It was spoken in major cities like Tenochtitlan, but also in an area stretching from central Mexico down into Guatemala and parts of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, places like that, right? By the time the Spanish arrived, Nahuatl was already a super widespread language known throughout most of the area. So let's talk about the impact of the arrival of the Spanish and colonization by the Spanish. So in the early 16th century, everything changed for the Aztecs when Hernan Cortez arrived on the shores of what is nowadays Yucatan, I believe, if I remember correctly. And his army overthrew the Aztec Empire in 1521, which I was actually reading a story the other day about this, specifically the language aspect of this. And part of the reason that Hernan Cortez had such an easy time overthrowing the Aztecs was because Moctezuma, the leader at the time, was under the impression that he was a deity returned to Earth in human form, and so essentially granted him quite a bit of access to the empire and made it quite easy to be overthrown, unfortunately. So with the arrival of Hernan Cortez and the overthrow of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire came the imposition of Spanish in language and in culture and in everyday life. Right? Throughout the course of history, Spanish came to dominate daily life, politics, and government, right? With Nahuatl kind of being pushed to the side. The Nahuatl language and culture at this time was super suppressed and pushed to the side, and it led to the language to start to die out, unfortunately, right? As indigenous languages all over Mexico and Central America were suppressed in favor of a common language that could unite the empire of Spanish. So despite centuries of decline, Nahuatl is actually still in use today, and it is the most spoken language in Mexico besides Spanish, with 1.5 million speakers concentrated mostly in Mexico and parts of Guatemala. In Mexico, most of the speakers are found in rural areas that have kind of escaped, say, the influence of Spanish, right? Especially in the states surrounding Mexico City, like Puebla, Veracruz, Hidalgo, and Guerrero. Although you definitely do hear it in Mexico City as well if you're in the right parts and you're paying attention. But obviously those are people who are coming from outside of Mexico City to Mexico City, not necessarily were born and lived there all their life, right? And even though this language has kind of been in decline for a while, there are actually significant efforts to both preserve this language and revive its use, especially in the area. However, there are also challenges with urbanization and modernization, Spanish becoming more. Nahuatl is increasingly in danger of going extinct because young people prefer Spanish and English for their communication, as it's more useful within the context of professional development, right? Leaving this historically underappreciated language in danger of dying out if it weren't for these efforts of preservation. So in recent years, there's been a growing interest in revitalizing Nahuatl and making it more frequently used. Everything from cultural movements based around their heritage, language preservation programs, and even government initiatives in Nahuatl and Spanish. The language is definitely making a bit of a comeback. Universities in Mexico Now we'll even offer Nahuatl language programs where people can go and learn the language, be it for like a minor or even a full to go teach later on in college. And a lot of rural areas within these Nahuatl speaking areas, the language as part of their educational curriculum within the school system itself. However, even with all of these good things, there is some dangers facing the Nahuatl language, right? Many younger generations are not learning it fluently, similar to the phenomenon you see with immigrants in the US, where, the people come from Mexico or Central America, parents speak it, kids kind of speak it, and grandkids for the part kind of lose it. You see this with Nahuatl within Mexico, right? Part of the problem is it's not seen as a very practical language. Business and trade is not, government politics is not taking place in this language. So many people choose to focus more on the Spanish and more so nowadays English in order to get ahead. Especially for monolinguals in Nahuatl, this can be problematic. I don't really think you find this nowadays, other than maybe a couple grandparents out there, but they're gonna have a really hard time finding a job if that's their only language. So Nahuatl nowadays Nahuatl has had a huge influence on Spanish, specifically in the realms of food, and specifically in Mexico, they use a lot of Nahuatl words for the native wildlife, right? In the realm of food, we get words like chocolate, aguacate, cacahuate, tomate, right? In Mexico, a lot of the animals get Nahuatl names instead of the more common Spanish names. Like in Mexico, they call a possum a tlacuache instead of a zerigüeya. They call vultures sopilotes instead of buitres. And instead of calling an owl a búho, they call it a tecolote. So while there is very much more of a positive spin to this language nowadays, there is also still a stigma attached to speaking an indigenous language, as it's often seen as a barrier to success, right? This is something that we see both in Mexico as well as all over the world, as more global languages like English and Spanish come and take more prominent positions within the world. So the big question is, where does Nahuatl go from here? And while it's clear that the language has a rich history and is still an integral part of Mexican identity for many, right, efforts to preserve and revitalize it are more important than ever, right? But it's going to take the effort of communities, educators, and governments to ensure that it survives and thrives for future generations. Nahuatl isn't just a language, it's a legacy that connects people to their past, their history, and all of the accomplishments of the Aztec Empire that came before them. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video about Nahuatl. If you guys are interested in learning more, be sure to put in the comments below. I'll send you my number and we can talk. If you found this video interesting, be sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next video.